Okay, welcome to this screencast of Reading in Psychology, and I want to acknowledge and thank Patricia Kloosterman for providing the Foundation PowerPoint for us. I want to begin by talking about what is a scholarly article. It's a written piece of work, as you can read here, that informs and reports on an original research, experimentation to the rest of the scholarly world. One of the challenges with this type of resource is that a reader is assumed to have similar background, and sometimes that can be intimidating. You'll hear me refer to scholarly articles as primary pieces of research. They're journal or a journal article, so don't let those terminology changes fool you either. Specifically for this course, we'll be focusing on empirical studies, which are original research reports and contain distinct sections that follow the research process. We'll refer to this as a primary article or simply a journal article. There's also other types of scholarly articles of literature reviews. Those are not particularly useful for us, as I find they cover a whole and do a review of a whole bunch of different research pieces and often are really quite complex. Not to say they wouldn't be useful to you, but just not for our purposes. You also might see theoretical articles, case studies, methodological reporting on new or unique ways of measuring behavior, for example, or experiences, or other types of articles that we can see in scholarly pieces of research or journals might be brief reports, editorials, book reviews. Again, these are not going to be useful for us. We'll be referring to the empirical article, and therefore I'll refer to those as primary or journal articles. You'll find and get access to scholarly articles through our library electronically or through open access, typically not in just a general Google search. You might find some references to that, but not always. And they're not available in bookstores. So it's through our library resources. They're academic in nature. They also must be peer-reviewed. And what this really means for you, as you can read here, is that a series of experts have reviewed the information and it has met strict criteria. Other experts take a look at that and determine that it is an appropriate resource to be put out there. What does a scholarly article look like, or how might you recognize it? Well, authors will be clearly stated with their affiliation, and by affiliation where they work, who funded them, or what university or college they're associated with. In most cases, it'll have an abstract. It'll only contain graphs and charts, very, very few, if any, photographs, and they're not glossy, sort of like in magazine pictures. You won't see those. It also contains a reference list, and we'll talk more about the format of that in a minute. That formatting or writing style for scholarly articles is very strict and standardized, and a uniform style allows us to be able to identify pieces of information very quickly. Once you get good at using the style, you'll know where exactly to look for the type of information you're searching for. Different types of articles, journal articles, will have different formats. There might be the Council of Science Editors for the harder sciences, and I use that in quotation marks. Things like biology, physics, chemistry. Chicago Manual of Style, MLA, American Sociological Association are all different forms of writing styles. The ones you'll be looking at, and the one I'm going to be talking about today, is the American Psychological Association. Not surprising in a psychology course. APA style is used in psychology, but not only in psychology. It's also used in many of the helping professions. So the field of education, social work, nursing, business, and other behavioral and social sciences. So it's one you need to get familiar with. The style guidelines come from this publication manual, and it outlines the structure, content, how we cite things, and the mechanics that need to be used in any particular article that's being presented. You'll reference this and take a look at this again. You will have in your communications classes, but we'll also be taking a look at it in the plagiarism tutorial that you have to start working your way through this week. So I want to give you some tips and tricks for reading an empirical article, or as I've said, I call it primary or journal article because it's intimidating at first. The resources that we're going to be using will have the following parts: a title, an abstract, an introduction, a methods, a results, a discussion, and a reference list. Those are the standard pieces. A couple of notes here. The introduction is sometimes called background, and more often than not, it actually doesn't have a heading. So you'll see the title of the article, the abstract, and it'll jump right into this section. Sometimes you'll see introduction, sometimes background, sometimes nothing. The other thing that can be confusing is the methods section can have subheadings underneath it, And the discussion section sometimes is lumped together with a conclusion. Sometimes it's called a conclusion. Sometimes it's called a couple of different things. Let's start with the title. A title identifies the variables of interest and the relationship that they've found between them. It's usually 12 words in length. You can see in my example here, the selective impact of chocolate craving on visuospatial working memory tells you that we're looking at cravings and working memory. You can see here the authors are listed, and you can see with the little superscripts there that all three of them are connected to the Flinders University in Australia, and in particular, the first author is an employee of the School of Psychology at that university. You could assume that the other two are students. I want you to be cautious here, though, as you can see from my notes, that a title can be misleading. Think about a newspaper title, right? It's trying to grab your attention and encourage you to read more, so it may not give you the full picture. An abstract is a brief summary of the contents, and it typically describes the following things: the purpose of the study, the participants, the methodology, the findings, the conclusions, and the implications. As you can see in our example here, it's about a paragraph long. I want you to be really cautious here, though, because it doesn't have a chance to give you all of the details, and in fact can be misleading. Usually it's the first thing that you'll read. It's often the last thing written by the authors. So again, it's just giving you that overview. And when you're doing a library search, this is all you'll get on the actual article. But never assume that it's going to be a perfect fit for you, even if it sounds really exciting here. I want to talk a little bit about the introduction. Remember, I said sometimes it's called background. Sometimes, or more often than not, there is not a title. And you'll notice in our example here, there's no title given. It's just jumped from the abstract into this. I want you to use the image of a funnel. You can see it here on the right. This is just a generic example from any good writing. You start with an introduction, supporting statements, down to your thesis statement. But a funnel analogy is important. It talks about how broad it is at the top, lots of different information. So thinking about our title, you'd be expecting us to see about cravings and talking about the impact of those cravings on memory. And then it gets more and more specific, often background research. How did we get to this question? And then our thesis statement. And in the case of research papers, you're actually going to have the hypothesis identified. So this is the first part of the introduction or background that we're looking at here. You see a big overview of the problem that will be investigated and why it's important. So you see here in the stars that we're looking at the term craving described, so it's really broad. And then as you start reading down this way and over here, you start seeing it getting more specific. And you see that it's referencing other pieces of research. If we continue on, again, remembering that funnel image, we're sort of in this section in the middle of that funnel where it's starting to narrow. Previous research and leading to this current study. So you see that now we're now starting to get down to the nitty-gritty of what this study would be about. And then at the end of the introduction or background, you get a specific detail and prediction about this particular study. And you can usually look for keywords. The present experiment tested this prediction. So we've got it down now to what it is we're looking at. So as you're reading in your head, the idea that it was really wide and is now getting quite narrow. The methods section describes in detail how the current study was conducted. So think back to Intro to Psych and you'll know all the research methods. You'll see some of that language used here. In Intro to Psych, you might have talked about the operational definition of variables too, and I often use the example in class about experiments. The experiment. How do we define it? So let's say we're talking about exercise. 15 minutes of exercise for each of you might mean very different things than it does for me. Let me share my definition. 5 minutes of finding my exercise clothes, 5 minutes of doing something, and 5 minutes congratulating myself. Does that classify as 15 minutes of exercise for you? Are we talking about the same thing? That's why we have to define things. And it's often here in this section that we'll get a definition of what they mean. So what does chocolate craving in our example mean? It consists usually, and sometimes there's headings, as you see here after the word method. Who were the participants? What were their sampling procedures? How did they pick them? What measures or what research design was happening? So in this case, participants were 96 female undergraduate students. Again, referring back to Intro to Psych and asking good critical thinking questions, you'd want to ask some information about why is it just females? Why is there 96? What age group are they? Is that relevant for what I'm looking at? So if you were interested in chocolate cravings and memory, and but you were working with older men, this study might not be for you. Then we get into often what students indicate is the most difficult section, and it's the results section. It contains results of statistical analyses performed with the data, and it's often intimidating and confusing. It's written for somebody with stats knowledge. It includes tables and figures, again, very confusing. So if you see the unedited version here, you might be very overwhelmed. Results, sometimes they have intermediate headings like this, but look at all of this stuff. Many people find that intimidating. You don't know what the t-test is, you don't know what it means, you don't know what the probability means. So here's a tip for you. Let's move on to my tips page. Don't be intimidated. Look for the words. Well-written articles say in words what all the jargon is talking about. Let me show you what I mean. On the left here, we have the same sample I initially showed you. And on the right, if you're just looking for the words, I've highlighted those for you. A random assignment to the condition had produced 2 equivalent groups. What's that mean? 2 equivalent groups. Specifically, the craving and the control group were not different. Oh, that's good. And see where I crossed out all the numbers and jargon? You didn't need to know that, but that's what it tells you, is this statement. Again, down here, if you continue, the craving group did not differ from the control group when they got to the lab, but did at every other point. That's important to know, too. That means that something changed for them. And here, the effect of chocolate craving on cognitive performance. These indicated that only on one type of test did that happen. Again, we're going to get some practice in doing this. In the results section, look for the words. Ignore the number part. That takes us to the discussion section. It starts with a statement of support or non-support for your hypothesis, repeats the results and compares them, and gives interpretation of the results. It also states limits and implications and gives direction to future research. And I've highlighted some things for you to think about there. Again, just looking at the words, what did they find? You can see that here. And what, in terms of working memory, did they find? Sometimes the conclusion section will be rolled into this as well, and sometimes they'll be separated. I want to talk at the end here about the reference list. Lots of students will just ignore this component. But if you found a piece of research, let's say this wasn't exactly what you were looking for, this gives you a good overview of the current researchers in the area. So let's take a look at this one. See how many times Baddeley is listed here? That's often a good tip that this person is a key researcher in the area, and you might actually want to go and do a search on their work to see if you can find more current things. You can see I've got a 1974, 1998, so it's across the span as well, right? Again, this is an older research paper, but if we were talking about a more recent one, you can figure out who the lead researchers are. This always allows you to locate that, and it's always done in APA format. Remember that stuff you're learning in communications? You'll see it again in the plagiarism tutorial, but you'll see it referenced in this in an appropriate way here with the indentation, the punctuation, and the order or sequence that things are presented in. A couple of other notes. The first time reading an empirical article can be really overwhelming. Stick with it. Remember, these articles are written for other researchers, and feel proud of your accomplishment when you make your way through it. You'll need to read the article more than once. You'll need to be persistent, and I need you to ask for help if you need it. When you're looking up the article, read one section at a time, but it doesn't matter which order that you attack it in. Often for me, I'll read the title, then I'll take a look, scan quickly through the introduction, and I get to the bottom part, remember that funnel, to say, what is this study actually looking at? Then I'll often skip over the results section and the methods section and get to the discussion. Find that that works best. Some people like to start at the end and work their way backwards. It doesn't matter where you start. With the guide I've provided you, you know what each section's supposed to be doing. Look up the words you're not familiar with. Make notes in your own words. An avoiding plagiarism tutorial has some specific tips on how to take notes and how to do this so that you're not plagiarizing. That's all for now. Have fun with your first article.